Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's event that is a part of Gallatin's celebration of the Black History Month. My name is Mehmet Tarakçıoğlu, and I am the Assistant Dean for Global Programs at Gallatin. And I also have the privilege of working with Gallatin's Urban Democracy Lab, that is the sponsor of this event. We have a series of other exciting events for the Black History Month, which you can find at Gallatin's events calendar, and I hope you will join us for those events too. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Delio Vasquez, who is our distinguished speaker for tonight. Delio is a postdoctoral and faculty fellow at Gallatin School of Individualized Study. He received his PhD in History of Consciousness with concentrations in politics and feminist studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Delio's interests include political theory, philosophy, and US social movements. His current research concerns theories of illegal politics produced during early modernity and the 1970s, their relationship to processes of decolonization, and the political import of these practices among the poor today. He has published writing on the Black Panthers' analysis of globalization, intercommunalism, and on the rise of Black Lives Matter movement, among other topics, and most recently, an essay on Michel Foucault. Prior to joining NYU, Delio taught courses with the Prison University Project at San Quentin Prison, at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and to inner city students in New York City. We are also joined by Gianpaolo Baiocchi, the director of Urban Democracy Lab. Gianpaolo is a sociologist and an ethnographer interested in questions of politics and culture, critical social theory, and cities. He will be moderating the discussion tonight. If you have any questions, please write them down during the presentation, and Gianpaolo will pose them to Delio. So on this note, I will turn it over to Delio to hear more about revolutionary intercommunalism and the Black Panther Party. Let's give him a warm virtual welcome to Gallatin and to this event.
Hello, everyone. Hello. I feel very fortunate to have this opportunity to engage with so many of you at once. I wish I were able to see your faces, read your body gestures, and sense your moods as I speak, so that I could be more responsive to them. After my presentation, I hope that the conversation can be as horizontal as possible, rather than being just centered on myself. Thank you, Mehmet, Gianpaolo, and the Urban Democracy Lab for providing the space and structure to make this conversation possible. Given our societal isolation these days, the few forms that we do have are all the more valuable. At the same time, hopefully we can together simultaneously continue the efforts accelerated this past summer to, quote, blacken the commons, as Dr. Milton has put it. The more disconnected we are, the more important it clearly becomes, at least to me, to emphasize our collective humanity and be open about the shortcomings of communication, of the media we speak through, and the increased isolation of the positions we speak from. That is especially so when the content is ethically fraught, burdened with the traumatic, and when it pushes at the borders of the permissible. That is, when the content involves the matter of imposed law, criminalization, and the illegal. The matter of the everyday ways that the Black, poor, and other oppressed people navigate systems of domination in order to sustain and reproduce themselves, ourselves. And the ways that these diffuse everyday practices are conceived of, sometimes in abstracted and romanticized ways, but more often actively dissociated from, repressed, and burdened by oversimplification of all sorts. Lastly, in presenting this material, my intention is to make this history and the ideas produced by these social movement actors as intimately understood as possible. We of course know that the Black Panther movement had many shortcomings. That's not a question really, but there are many aspects of it that are still poorly understood. Accordingly, part of my pedagogical approach is to treat these difficult histories and ideas as generously as possible, and to try to create space for those aspects that appear to possibly have value for us going forward. Thank you for your time. Okay, so the Black Panther Party at the State Capitol Building, Sacramento, California, May 2nd, 1967. Is this a menacing image of masculinist Black militancy? Or is it a photograph capturing an anxious look of worry on the face of a Black boy holding onto a symbol as he stands inside of an apparatus of white supremacist power? As I've been discussing with my students this semester, the Black Panther Party actively made use of and deployed imagery and symbolism as a technique in their struggle to create a long-term political vehicle that would enable the survival of the Black community. While achieving much success with these tactics, they also wondered at times if the images came to circulate much too far beyond the party's ability to define and control. It is essentially this question of control over phenomena, over experience, over land and bread, over people, and over that which escapes control, which is the primary concern of this talk. As the Panthers sought to chart out a strategic method towards Black liberation. This talk will be primarily historical. The exceptions to this will be in the brief introduction on Black fugitivity, during the section on understanding poverty, given some elaborations on my part that I believed would be necessary for fully grasping and empathizing with the Panthers' approach, and then also some concluding critical questions for thought and discussion. In Black studies today, the term has been taken up across a wide range of contexts, but just as the development of the field of Black studies itself in the 1960s came out of social movement struggles, so I would suggest it is important to ground the concept of Black fugitivity in practice. In scenes of subjection, terror, slavery, and self-making in the 19th century America, Saidiya Hartman emphasizes the centrality of practice. To live as a slave always necessarily meant that one was exploiting the limits of the permissible and creating transient zones of freedom. According to Hartman—
Delia, oh. Sorry. Are you meaning to share your screen? The image didn't show for folks.
Sorry? I mean, I intend to be sharing the slide on Black fugitivity. Is it not coming up?
Not coming up.
Okay, all right. Let's see.
Sorry to interrupt. You were just building up speed. I was like,
I was. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Gianpaolo. All right.
We got it.
How about, are we set there? Saidiya Hartman?
We're good.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right. So now elaborating on Hartman, Tina Kemp, oh yeah, I'm sorry about that. So I meant to emphasize the image right here of this Black Panther Party member, which at first looks, yeah, like I said, menacing and masculinist. But if I think we look closer, I think we can identify a look of worry, the person's youth, etc. Anyways, okay. So Tina Kemp has described Black fugitivity, building on Hartman, as a refusal of those cataloged to be completely captured or reduced to the archival grammar of criminality. Even when she has de-emphasized practical resistance under slavery, though, Kemp has nonetheless centered the conscious intentionality of refusal and the spirit of it. I think this is important today in a time when figures like Assata Shakur, former member of the Black Liberation Army, are more often held up as symbols of innocence and unjust persecution rather than militant fugitivity and Black self-determination. On the other hand, Damien Sojourner has taken the term up in a useful and somewhat opposite direction, emphasizing the reality of practice over conscious intentionality. That is, the ways that Sojourner has used the term Black fugitivity to talk about high school dropouts, Black teenage boys whose passive withdrawal and disengagement from the alienating school system emphasizes less conscious refusal than a practice and an indirect relationship emotionally to the action. Sojourner helps us identify that fugitivity always reveals the harm imposed by what is being fled, whether the person fleeing can articulate their rationale or not. As he explains, the fugitive is the simultaneous embodiment of life, culture, and pathways to freedom on the one hand, and the singular exposure of the state as a tenuous system of unstable structures constantly teetering on the brink of legitimacy on the other. I would agree, but if this practice need not even be conscious, right, or consciously political, then what are we talking about? Returning to the thought of Frantz Fanon, David S. Marriott has explained, to explain this triumph of life, Fanon takes the example of criminality as if it were a normal analogy for life itself in the colony, or as if the life of the masses were incompatible with the laws that constrain it. However, Fred Moten has noted with critical concern, such disorder appears for Fanon as, quote, both symptom and cure, a symptom of oppression and a staging for political criminality. Moten asks, what is the relationship between what Fanon, as a medical doctor, observes as pathological criminal impulsiveness and the wars for national liberation that Fanon himself participated in? He offers, quote, it is necessary to consider, along with Fanon, how program and informality, organization and spontaneity go together, end quote. Ultimately, this variability, this fugitivity, this very uncertainty is exactly what the Black Panther Party, as revolutionaries in the tradition of Frantz Fanon, sought to channel and organize. The Black Panther Party saw Black Americans as a colonized people, dispossessed and separated from the land and hyper-exploited for their labor. Two brief notes before I continue. I'll go back to this main page as I do that. One, despite the connection between Black fugitivity and the histories of the Black Liberation Army, underground guerrilla group that branched off of or preceded the Black Panther Party, that is not what I'll be speaking about today. Instead, it is on intercommunalism and the concept of Black fugitive life. Secondly, as close readers of these literatures of Fanon, of Dr. Moten, of Marriott know well, strictly speaking, the concepts of Black fugitivity are not exclusive to one quote, race or skin color. It's not exclusive to what the population referred to as Black people today. However, we call it Black fugitivity because Afro-diasporic people, through our efforts to merely live under modern society, have been so fundamentally criminalized. When you as a human being are, by state law, labeled as private property, as a slave, this means that your real existence itself thus reveals the absurdity of the label and of the laws that enforce it. The idea that a human being or any aspect of nature can be possessed by another. Arguably, we cannot actually possess anything at all. We cannot possess human beings, animals, the land, or water. We can only punish, confine, and kill whenever those beings or phenomena flee or act other than how we desire them to. Okay, onto the party. Strictly speaking, the Black Panther Party developed out of a frustration with and critique of other Black organizations at the time in the Bay Area, California. On the one hand, the Panthers were critical of what they termed cultural nationalists. These were cultural and literary groups that either explicitly or implicitly held the view that freedom for Black people might come simply by dressing differently, changing your name, or otherwise asserting a new identity as an individual or part of a community. While not disagreeing with the importance of these struggles over self-representation, Newton and Seal saw liberation as most of all requiring a transformation of material conditions, of economic life, of capitalism. Because the reality was and is today that Black people's suffering is defined most fundamentally by their poverty and exclusion from the resources accumulated and hoarded by US elites. The Panthers knew that one cannot have Black liberation under capitalism. However, the Panthers were just as critical of Black anti-capitalist movements that theorized and even trained for armed struggle, but did so in a manner detached from the larger Black community, what they term revolutionary cultism. Newton and Bobby Seale insisted that Black liberation required organizing directly with the mass of the Black community, the poor, part-time workers, part-time students, the unemployed, ex-military, the criminalized, hustlers, sex workers, etc. To form the party, Newton and Seale learned about struggles of decolonization occurring at the time in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but knowing that the colonial condition of Black people in the US was distinct, they gathered survey data, going door to door among their neighbors to ask people directly what their needs were. So they combined this data and their own experiences, and they found that children playing in the streets were being run over by commuter cars, that people like Denzel Dowell were constantly being brutalized by police, and that there was an epidemic of hunger among the youth. In each case, the Panthers first went to public officials, federal poverty programs, city council members, the county sheriff, etc., to get their issues addressed. And when these approaches inevitably failed to produce practical results, they took action themselves and developed their own strategies and programs. Part of the reason that the Black Panther Party is so poorly understood today is because they operated in strict accordance with a distinction between what they called political actions and military actions. Newton cited Vietnamese communist Ho Chi Minh, who said that military tactics made public for military reasons are unsound, while military tactics made public for political reasons are perfectly correct. We have done as he said, when our military strategies are known, it is for political reasons, end quote. So that is, under modern liberal society, with its emphasis on representation, images, statements, and symbols, these things often stand in for political power, say the Panthers. On the other hand, while the actual practice of carrying out an action to directly change material reality is direct political struggle, they argued, by contrast, and in its sharpest instantiation, the form that takes is war. So for the Panthers, they cited directly from Mao Zedong, who said that politics is war without bloodshed, while war is politics with bloodshed. People who've seen the Hampton movie recently, is likely familiar to them at this point. But of course, for the Panthers as poor young Black people, this is important. This distinction was grasped already from the lives lived under constant criminalization. Just to make it on an everyday basis, one knew certain things have to be done out of sight, under the table, while other things need to be done openly to get a message across. But the most important thing is accomplishing the goal. Take, for example, the Black Panther Party's so-called invasion of the California State Capitol building in Sacramento, May 2nd, 1967. In direct response to the earlier successes of the Panthers' Cop Watch program, through which they policed the police, surveilling and disrupting them as they harassed Black people in the community, California Republicans passed a law to criminalize open carry of weapons in California. Clearly understanding the legislative process, knowing well that by the time a bill is voted on, all the backroom negotiation over who will vote yes or no has already happened, grasping well that the Capitol building is a theater and not where real power is exercised, the Panthers engaged in a peaceful protest at the Capitol as part of a political action of representation to be seen by the broader Black community, relying, of course, on the mass media's predictable tendency to be drawn to spectacle and to the sensational. The guns were used as symbols, political tools, not military tools, and never fired on that day. And the Panthers were effectively able, through their pre-prepared press statement, Executive Mandate Number 1, to present a condensed critique of US imperialist military actions abroad, militarized policing and concentration camps at home, and to illustrate the racism of the explicitly targeted disarming of Black people through the law. Between 66 and 71, the Black Panther movement went through multiple shifts in strategy, influenced by a range of tendencies and practices developed across the 68 national chapters. Summarizing these shifts, Newton stated that they went from Black nationalists seeking sovereign nation-state territory to revolutionary nationalists developing anti-capitalist alliances with non-Black groups in order to more effectively challenge US capitalism, to internationalists exchanging resources, knowledge, and skills with other colonized third world movements globally and establishing an embassy in Algeria. Newton, however, was in prison during the period of the party's greatest expansion, from 67 until 70. Accordingly, upon his release, what he did was less so invent a new ideology as much as synthesize and innovatively reinterpret and recontextualize the changes that had occurred while he was gone. He called this new synthesis, this analysis of reality, the theory of intercommunalism. According to Newton in 1970, nation states can no longer meaningfully be said to exist. Building on Lenin and others, he argued that nation state sovereignty had been overtaken by a global capitalist empire, what we today might call globalization, and that this had made all movements for national liberation obsolete. Noting the US's increasing usage of the term police action starting in 1950 to refer to military campaigns waged without a formal declaration of war by Congress, Newton stated, quote, "We can even refer to this army as the intercommunal police force. They control communities they do not live in and have no interest in, and they're controlled by the ruling clique for purposes of profit and personal and military might." However, according to Newton, this new form of empire, because it dominated not just through military might, but also through a distinctly capitalist logic. incorporating third world and even first world territories as resources for labor and as potential markets for selling commodities. So this means that all the ideological, legal, technological, and communications infrastructure used to support those markets in effect function, according to Newton, as arms of empire. At the same time, this same capitalist infrastructure that allows for globalized capitalist empire, according to Newton, also would create the shared social and material conditions among the population. As Elaine Brown would later put it, she was a chair of the party from 74 to 77, quote, though he did not live long enough to know of the internet, Huey argued that as technology was bringing the world ever closer together, the world's people were poised to recognize their common oppressor and unite around their common oppression. For Newton, these shared conditions would also increasingly include underemployment, unemployment, precarity, and a legal status below that of the comfortable working class, a state of fugitive life. Quote, taking careful note of the social trends and the ever-changing nature of things, we see that the lumpen proletarians are the minority and the proletarians are the majority. Technology is developing at such a rapid rate, the automation will progress to cybernation and cybernation to technocracy. The lumpen proletariat here refers to the unemployed sector of the population, the criminalized, the underemployed, while the proletariat refers to the traditional working class, loosely speaking. Quote, today's capitalist has developed machinery to such a point that he can hire a group of specialized people called technocrats. In the near future, he will certainly do more of this, and the technocrat will be too specialized to identify as working class. In fact, that group of technocrats will be so vital that we will have to do something to explain the presence of other people. We'll have to come up with another definition and reason for existing. To be clear, Newton doesn't state that comfortably waged workers will cease to exist, but that there would be so few of them that working class identity with its qualities would fade. Identifying even the effects of austerity on working class whites, Newton stated, even the populations of the Anglo-American Empire itself are in the process of being nativized and pauperized. He says, you will then find an integration between the Black unemployable and the white racist hard hat who is not regularly employed and mad at the Blacks who who he thinks threaten his job. We hope that he will join forces with those people who are already unemployable, but whether he does or not, his material existence will have changed. Because Black people, often the last hired and the first fired, have been experiencing this already for decades, the Black Panther Party grasped that survival itself would become the central matter of political struggle. The Panthers sought to sustain the people themselves while simultaneously also working to establish institutions that would allow all people to eventually disconnect from capitalism and connect instead to the party organization as their primary means to life. Today, the Panthers are increasingly well known for the social programs, the breakfast program, run at the time overwhelmingly by the female majority rank and file membership of the party. However, as the Panthers' history has consistently been distorted, at times by conservatives and at times by liberals, these programs have repeatedly been misunderstood as charity programs or as reformist. Historian Robin Spencer's book, Revolution Has Come, is an outstanding and I would say still underappreciated text that explains very clearly how these programs worked in practice, in Oakland especially, and the explicit function of these programs really as part of a project of social autonomy and communal living. The shift in Panther strategy can be better grasped, though, I would say, through a close look at the underappreciated intervention made by Illinois Black Panther Party chairman Fred Hampton in 1969. For Newton in '68, before Hampton's intervention, the Panthers acted according to the view that the only way to create change as a colonized people was by creating a political consequence. See, hopefully this audio works. If it doesn't, please someone tell me. So in any case, here's Huey Newton explaining.
And so forth. And we see that black people don't have this political power. They don't have economical power. They don't have land power. We've been robbed. For instance, our black politicians have been ineffective. Not much of the time it's not their fault. It's simply because they don't have the grassroots political organization behind them. Even if they get votes from black people, simply to have a vote doesn't mean political power. In the political arena, a thing is not political unless there's a political consequence if the people don't get what they want. And black people in the past haven't been able to offer this consequence. For instance, according to John Hope Franklin, the reason that black Reconstruction failed, where you had many black candidates holding offices in the South, wasn't because these black candidates were ignorant or inefficient. Many of the black candidates had been educated in France and Canada, in England, and they were very efficient. But the reason that it failed is because blacks did not have economical or military power. That after they put their man into office, that he was still subject to these people who owned the land, that he was still subject to these people who owned the military. So black Reconstruction failed. And we say now we can develop a political consequence, we can develop political power by being a potentially destructive force. That black people arm themselves in a political fashion, and then if the aggression is continued against us, we'll be able to offer a political consequence. Very similar to Detroit.
Okay, so I can't hear it, but hopefully that was heard for others. So in Newton's view, the only strength that the black community had was, quote, as a potentially destructive force if we don't get freedom. So the Panthers did see riots as somewhat effective because they do create a political consequence. But from the beginning, they also criticized riots as, quote, sporadic, short-lived, and costly. That is, suicidal and costly in terms of black lives. For these reasons, in the text, Correct Handling of a Revolution, composed at the height of the 1967 riots, Newton argued against them and for guerrilla warfare as a less suicidal approach. This view informed the Black Panther Party military actions, underground actions, through 1968. By 69, however, the ratio of police deaths to Panther deaths, police injured to Panther injured, was about 1 to 2, according to Bobby Seale. It was in this bloody context that Fred Hampton's intervention proved to be a paradigm shift for the movement. Against the dominant position in the party, which supported the political bombings and actions pursued by the Weather Underground, Hampton took what Elaine Brown would later call a hardline and principled position on the matter of survival. Right.
Why do you feel that the approach of the SDS weatherman is the wrong approach?
I feel that it's wrong because it's pig action. You see, they're doing exactly what the pigs want them to do. They're leading people into a situation where it's an astronomical situation, too great for the people to deal with. It's a situation where you got a bunch of mechanical pigs with 357 Magnums and shotguns and mechanical mace and all that type of thing. And then they're talking about they're going to carry on the revolutionary struggle. That's not revolution, it's insanity, it's madness, it's nostalgia, and it's a massacre. That's what it's potential massacre, that's what it is. And we don't support that because we'd say all power to the people. All the power is manifested in the people. We don't have any people whose lives we believe that should be thrown away.
Okay, so Hampton echoes Newton's critique of riots, but takes a harder position against them. From 69 on, riots, bombings, and disconnected political violence, essentially, to clarify. From 69 on, then, the Black Panther Party movement as a whole increasingly grasped the very survival of Black people as a matter of political struggle. While never rejecting armed struggle, they no longer thought that destructive power was the only power that the Black community had. They concluded that their ability to sustain life, to make live, was an exercise of power also. So Hampton criticized white leftists for essentially treating people as objects within their romantic revolutionary vision. The Panthers were no less serious about revolution, but they weren't going to simply ignore the physical suffering of Black people. That was the whole point of the struggle. Where am I? Right. So this also reflected a continued rejection of Martin Luther King's advocacy of militant pacifism, of Martin Luther King's willingness to expose Black people to violence to create a spectacle. And instead, the Panthers supported Malcolm X's insistence on the human right to self-defense. Okay. Yeah, so I think the nuance of this position is continuously overlooked by people. And I believe that it is because of a class-based blindness. In explaining these ideas to others over the last few years, as interested as people are in the Panthers' approach to base building, to survival programs, to the idea of global connectivity, it seems that the hardest thing for people from middle-class backgrounds to grasp, honestly, is the political meaning of survival. The lived experience of poverty, of constant exposure to death, lived not as a metaphor, but in physical and psychosomatic danger in lived reality, is perhaps untranslatable. Hunger is a physical violence, but it does not create the spectacle that a police baton does. And so it is much harder to empathize with, to co-experience, and to co-suffer with. When we talk about Blackness then, but do not center the material violence of poverty, it creates an incomplete and harmful understanding of our reality. This dynamic has been worsened, I would argue, in recent decades by the near disappearance from public view of those that George Jackson once termed lumpen intellectuals. People like Fannie Lou Hamer and Malcolm X, militants who grew up and lived in poverty and criminality and theorized and spoke from those racial class positions. People like them were profoundly important as public intellectuals in the 60s and 70s. In the present, they're just about non-existent in mainstream conversations about Blackness today. Arguably as a certain notion of Black American identity centered around modern, liberal, and legalistic conceptions of citizenship, personal financial success, and white-like notions of innocence has instead expanded or grown in dominance. Honestly, this is a very difficult and sensitive topic to address within the university with many implications. Frankly, it is anxiety-inducing to bring up. But you know, I was listening to Cornel West talk the other day, and he was saying that on this matter of the quote-unquote Black bourgeoisie, that he gets criticized for it, but that he needs to keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it, because otherwise people will keep ignoring it.
Owners and so forth. And
Joy James is another person who has made this point consistently. Citing Black Panther Party Communications Secretary and current professor of law at Emory University, Kathleen Cleaver, Joy James explains, Kathleen Cleaver's critique of anti-revolutionary animus among Black Americans is useful today. I'm arguing that in the process of our assimilation, we acquire traits of a particular class. We're not the bourgeoisie, we're really the petty bourgeoisie because we don't collectively own that kind of wealth. But the way in which we perform and structure acts as if we're invested in capital. And so that creates a split between us and the working class and the poor, the so-called lumpen proletariat, but it's a split that's masked when we claim this universal Blackness as if experientially we all live with the same vulnerability to the police and poverty. Bell Hooks has written extensively on this, I would say in a less antagonistic way. She has stated, those who strive to speak, write, and act from ways other than the privileged class locations must self-interrogate constantly so that we do not unwittingly become complicit in maintaining existing exploitative and oppressive structures. None of us should be ashamed to speak about our class power or lack of it. Overcoming fear, even the fear of being immodest, and acting courageously to bring issues of class as well as radical standpoints into the discourse of Blackness is a gesture of militant defiance, one that runs counter to the bourgeois insistence that we think of money in particular and class in general as a private matter. Until these differences are grappled with openly, the real meaning of what it is to be poor and Black and struggle for survival in this society will continue to be overlooked. And without that, Black people like the Panthers, who spoke and acted with integrity, conviction, and love for Black people and the global oppressed, will continue to be easily dismissed as crazy, as marginal, and as criminal. By 1970, the Black Panther Party's strategic separation between political actions and military actions had completely dissolved. Black Panther Party members, affiliates, and supporters across the US and internationally were subject to assassinations, militarized SWAT team attacks, frame-ups, psychological manipulation, and torture at the hands of local police, FBI, and CIA. Some Panthers fled the country to Mexico, Canada, Algeria, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Portugal, the Congo, Tanzania, and other destinations undetermined. Many more Panthers stayed in the US, but had no option if they wanted to live, but to go underground and sustain themselves that way. Akanele Umoja has presented so far the clearest scholarly account of the Black Liberation Army, which is still depicted by so many incorrectly as some kind of insurrectionary group when it was not. The generalized law breaking present in our society in this time period is still subject to a kind of societal amnesia, I would suggest. Few of us today can sit with the cognitive dissonance produced by trying to grasp the reality of 130 plane hijackings between 1968 and 1972, 1,900 domestic bombings in 1972 alone, hundreds of Black-led urban riots, and a massive underground fugitive economy produced through the movements of over 100,000 Americans who fled the military draft by going abroad. The struggle of the Black Panther movement, its underground cells, and their affiliates was just a prominent subset of this generalized reality. And then in the middle of this, the Oakland chapter chose a form of strategic reorientation, engaging the symbolic action of disavowing above ground armed struggle and pursuing the program of the theory of intercommunalism in accordance with the philosophical concept of the structured vehicle as conceptualized by Huey Newton. Quote, "Tonight I ask you to assume that an external world exists, an external world that exists independently of us. The second assumption I would like for you to make is that things are in a constant state of change, transformation, or flux. The Black Panther Party has chosen materialist assumptions on which to ground its ideology. This is a purely arbitrary choice. Idealism might be the real happening. We might not be here at all. We don't really know whether we are in Connecticut or in San Francisco, whether we are dreaming and in a dream state, or whether we are awake and in a dream state. Perhaps we're just somewhere in a void. We simply can't be sure. But because the members of the Black Panther Party are materialists, we believe that someday scientists will be able to deliver the information that will give us not only the evidence, but the proof that there is a material world and that its genesis was material, motion, and matter, not spiritual. To us, power, first of all, is the ability to define phenomena, and secondly, the ability to make these phenomena act in a desired manner. It is the revolutionary concepts which define and interpret phenomena and establish the goals toward which the political vehicle will work. A revolutionary vehicle is in fact a revolutionary concept set into motion by a dedicated cadre through a particular organized structure. The political vehicle of the people must be guided by a consistent ideology, which represents nothing more than a systematic and organized set of principles for analyzing and interpreting objective phenomena. Oppressed Black people, the lumpen proletariat, did not have a structured organization to represent their true interests until the Black Panther Party arose from within the community, motivated by the needs and conditions of the people. While making as few assumptions as possible, Newton's philosophical approach was thus meant to be inclusive of the whole of experience. I'm gonna lose my spot. I see, okay. So ultimately, through what I've come to understand as an epistemology of suffering, Newton proposes that the structured vehicle can channel the experiences of people as they experience and exert their will over the phenomena that arise for them in light of their needs and desires. The point of reclaiming land, of seizing space, of occupying a territory is to create new communities and institutions in the way that you want, humane ones designed to help people flourish and be happy. Because this fugitive flourishing and happiness is itself a threat to state and capital, the Black Panther Party sought to develop a structure that would incorporate their expectation of this. Under state society, places of autonomous life are very often a threat to state legitimacy because they prove that life can be lived otherwise. And under capitalism, by definition, any forms of sustainable life that are outside of the circuits of profitability are always a threat to profit. Why would people ever pay for breakfast or for medical care or for housing when they can have it for free? All life that is lived fugitively outside of or even underneath capitalism is criminalized and targeted for repression. So as imprisoned Black Panther Party Field Marshal George Jackson would explain in more detail, as the otherwise abandoned masses flock to the intercommunalist institution of the Black commune, the increasingly threatened government would be expected to attack it. ensuring then that the masses would respond in turn by militantly defending these new institutions that sustained them materially and existentially. So the institution would itself be channeling suffering essentially into militancy. So this armed response would, by definition then, not be led by a small group of revolutionaries disconnected from the masses, acting in accordance with their romantic vision, but rather would be directly enacted by the masses themselves. The structured vehicle was meant to manage phenomena, inputs and outputs, to channel the homelessness, hunger, and suffering of Black people into militant self-defense. So class consciousness, solidarity, and revolutionary ethic would not precede political action, it would follow from it. So where am I? I see. French philosopher Michel Foucault understood and explained this clearly. The most crucial aspect of Jackson's reflections resides in the theorization of the relationship between military and political actions. This is a fundamental issue that was at the origin of the split between Newton and Cleaver. Cleaver criticized Newton for what he called his pacifism, his legalitarianism, in short, his revisionism. By contrast, Cleaver advocated the immediate shift to armed struggle, which he considered as the supreme form of political struggle. Jackson the militant condemned the military activism of the Weathermen and their actions, organized without strategic preparation and the support of the masses. Jackson gave his support to Newton and the popular action programs, such as the Free Breakfast Program to Black children in the ghettos. These programs will be increasingly threatened by fascist repression, specifically because they enable the Black community to organize itself. Such a causal relation informed Jackson's belief that these programs will soon become inconceivable without a military cadre. In this regard, then, according to Newton, repression breeds resistance that is revolutionary only if a structured vehicle channels that repression in a revolutionary direction. Quote, the only time an action is revolutionary is when the people relate to it in a revolutionary way. If they will not use the example you set, then no matter how many guns you have, your action is not revolutionary. Quote, of course, people do courageous things and call themselves the vanguard, but the people who do things like that are either heroes or criminals. They are not the vanguard because the vanguard means spearhead, and the spearhead has to spearhead something. If nothing is behind it, then it is divorced from the masses and is not the vanguard. Young people generally feel that the role of the revolutionary, Newton said, is to define a set of actions and a set of principles that are easy to identify and are absolute. But what I was trying to explain to them was the process. Revolution basically is a contradiction between the old and the new in the process of development. Anything can be revolutionary at a particular point in time, but most people don't understand that. In The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon describes the lumpen proletariat, the unorganized, irrepressible exertions towards life of the colonized and poor, as a mass of spontaneous energy that the colonial state will pay a high price for. In fact, Fanon argues, the colonial power will actively seek to create more of it through the imposition of more suffering and misery in order to cultivate it. The colonial forces cultivate lumpenization and spontaneity and then organize it, most often into police forces, Fanon argues. He describes how the poor were recruited in Algeria, Angola, and in the Congo, essentially against other poor people. Arguably, a comparable dynamic occurs here, but is obscured by skin color. And so for Fanon, it is not that the decolonial militants must make a choice about whether or not to organize the lumpen proletariat, the most precarious, but rather that, he says, they cannot afford not to. Fanon's argument is that these people are able to push history forward precisely because they are desperate, because they're unmanageable, and exist beyond the frame of rationality. For the Black Panther Party, grounded in Malcolm X's insistence on the human being's right to self-defense, conceived out of Huey Newton's analysis of anti-imperialism and the colonial condition of Black people, re-inspired by Fred Hampton's insistence on grasping survival itself as a matter of political struggle, and informed by George Jackson's identification of the experience of the criminalized poor and the prisoner as the most wretched, these young Black men and boys sought to channel the precarity and fugitivity of their own lives as they experienced them into a revolutionary project. The limits of their conceptualization are probably best understood by looking at their practice. Unfortunately, of course, today I don't have time to get into that history. And again, Robin Spencer's book is outstanding for this, the real place to go. Again, the text, the revolution has come. But the Oakland-based chapter essentially reintegrated itself into the traditional institutions of the Black community. So Black businesses, churches, gang organizations, and even electoral politics with its typical dynamics of legality and illegality as a way to essentially siphon off people and territory into the party's sphere of influence, into autonomy from US state and capital. Within that commune, built in the middle of a period of intense trauma and state repression, like many other communes historically, unsurprisingly, harmful dynamics proliferated. However, I would suggest that the merits of Black Panther Party thought should not be determined exclusively by those shortcomings as they arose. And more especially because so many iterations of the Black Panther movement continued elsewhere across the nation for a decade after. So I posited the simple outline of 3 questions here. This first question can be approached politically, philosophically. There's the question of the role. There's a lot of modern Western thought in Newton's thinking, Nietzsche, Marx, a lot of rationalism, notions of sovereignty that I think end up being reproduced in this. Second question that I was suggesting here, what is the gender fugitive life and the structured exposure to death? Obviously, there's an irreducibly male gendered aspect in how the Panthers, the main theorists, honestly, because the theorization was male gendered, there's a irreducibly male gendered aspect here regarding the causal relationship between exposure to state violence and willingness to engage in risky behavior. But I think many more questions can arise here. So, for example, what is the relationship to the social programs and or the sustaining of life to the question of channeling of experience? It's also, I think, worth including that given the quote gay liberation movement as it was understood at the time, Newton started suggesting that maybe homosexuals, LGBTQIA people might be the most oppressed people in society. And of course, in our present, many have emphasized that poor Black trans people often catch the very worst of police abuse, of exposure to death through alienation from institutions, of homelessness. And the last suggestion here, what of the enemy in this instance, of police, of opposing gangs? I think ultimately that, Gloria and Saldúa, and actually Fanon also, ultimately proposed that one's positionality in struggle shifts over time, where one finds oneself shifts over time. And I think the Panthers, following that line of thought, probably might have echoed that analysis. That's what I have. I hope people could appreciate some of that.
Well, thank you so much, Delio. That was just a terrific presentation. And I especially appreciate people who don't know, you were very generous to shape the talk in this way and to the sort of needs of our format. And I hope also that you feel really welcome by Gallatin and by the Urban Democracy Lab and by the NYU community today. You know, when we have someone like you join us, we like to have a proper in-person event, you know, so we can read people's body language, as you said, but also, you know, we can demonstrate that affection. So first of all, Delio, welcome and thank you for this really very nice talk. We're going to have some Q&A, but I thought at first, as a way to get us started, just to go in a slightly different way. I have lots of particular questions. There's some questions coming in, but I wonder if you might tell us, how did you land on this topic? Why was this your set of concerns, and how did you decide to approach the Panthers generously? How did you land on that way of doing things?
Sure. Ultimately, my questions were really quite other. It's really that I came to find that the Panthers had theorized on the questions that I was interested in so thoroughly after doing the research for a long time. So my initial project years ago was on trying to understand the political value of law breaking among the poor, having grown up in the Bronx, child of immigrants, knowing well that when people do harmful things, illegal things, seemingly very risky things, it's not because they're stupid or irrational, it's because there's some reason, there's some substantial motivation. In any case, as I did this research, I came to grasp that really the 1970s was such a rich time for the examination of this question. So the Panthers thought about this extensively. Foucault, as I mentioned, thought about this extensively. Obviously, Angela Davis, Grace Lee Boggs, and James Boggs, a whole batch of Marxist historians in the UK. Stuart Hall, obviously, E.P. Thompson, Hobsbawm, a set of French historians thinking on this question. And so, well, yeah, I don't know what else to say to that, but I'll add this actually. Several years ago, a movement occurred on the campus where I was doing my graduate studies that was against tuition hikes, led by undergraduate and graduate students were also present. And while they were successful in getting a tuition freeze, eventually the movement itself disintegrated over conflicts between on the question of class and race. And I decided that summer, because I needed a job, I would teach on the Panthers because I knew that they grappled with these questions extensively. Now I actually think, honestly, I think at least Newton ends up being quite class reductionist, honestly, but through that material came to realize that the theory of intercommunalism had really been written about very little, didn't circulate much. And so I thought to go do some archival research, pull up that material, and yeah, basically went from there. It's a long answer, sorry.
No. We're curious to know. There's so much to appreciate about your talk, and that a lot of questions are coming in. But let me ask you a couple. So one of the things that I learned from your talk today had always been this puzzle to me, like, why is it that the Black Panther Party, why does it sound so resonant to me to so many Latin American radical experiments and parties in the 80s and 90s? Why do they sound like the Zapatistas? Why do they sound like the MAS in Bolivia? Very different formations. And one thing that I came to understand from your talk today is the centrality of poverty and the materiality of poverty and the experience of poverty as a central element of this formation. And in those contexts, being poor, having poor people, centering poverty and the experience of poverty, again, differently Catholic liberation theologies in the mix and all that makes those resonances. But I wanted to ask you specifically a couple of things. So one of the things that the Latin Americans, the MAS grappled with, the Zapatistas grappled with, the Bolivarians and the workers' parties in Brazil, they all read Ho Chi Minh and Mao, and they looked at the Black Panthers. I'm not sure how directly influential it was. How was the question of internal democracy of the party? How was that thought of?
Right. So again, if we're talking about just the Oakland chapter, after after repression intensified, they actively closed down all these other chapters. Arguably, that there was quite an authoritarian exercise just in that practice, in stopping these local movements given their local conditions, and basically drawing activists from there to bring them to Oakland for this commune building project. Once it got going, yeah, I think, quite frankly, a very kind of Stalinist ethic was operating in the party or in that commune. Again, Robin Spencer's work, invaluable on this. I think that this matter of the channeling of experience can't really be separated from the fact of trauma, right? So essentially, in many ways, I think we can say, for Fanon and the Panthers, they are thinking about the channeling of trauma. So what does it mean to exert will and control over people in their traumatized state? Now, of course, this is exactly what the state does all the time. And so, the Panthers, yeah, I think it runs into these issues. I'd be interested in your thoughts, Gianpaolo, because I know these are questions for you, right? Yeah, that's what I can say to that. I also see a bunch of questions over here, but I'm not sure how best we want to approach them.
Well, let's go to some of them, because I think why don't we talk a little bit. There's an interesting question. If we think of the Oakland, if we kind of take the Oakland and move forward, well, there's a lot of, here's an interesting one. Thank you for highlighting the class divide between academics who merely sympathize with the working poor. Can you say more about the violence of poverty out inhibits or inhibited working poor participation in intercommunalism? This is from Natalie.
How it inhibits or working poor participation in the chapter itself. So the people that compose the party by that point are really quite a mix. They're quite a mix of people that are poor and middle class African Americans. It's again just talking about Oakland. So let's really, I've been thinking about this quite a lot. The party started really with just teenage boys, very young boys, early 20s men. And 8 months later, finally incorporated the first female member. And as we know, as they expanded nationally, then they became majority female. I think there's something to be said for the different class status and also even like phenotype, skin color of the population. So often the men were darker skinned and poorer. The women were lighter skinned and educated or had some kind of comfortable working class status. So that's something that I don't know anyone to have examined that question, but perhaps was in play in certain ways, in certain, structural ways when it came to the commune itself later. But I'm not sure that I can say more about that. On the violence of poverty itself, like I suggested, I think hunger in particular is a kind of violence that is just hard to empathize with, hard to grasp that other people are experiencing. Under our, in our contemporary society, we conceive of our experiences as so individuated from each other, and our ability to empathize, not just empathize, but experience with others is so delimited, obviously in the present with the isolation that we're experiencing. So I'm not sure I have a clear answer to your point, but to your question, but the set of thoughts that came from it.
Well, I wonder if we could pick up on this question of gender, and we can talk about the point you were alluding to in gender fugitive life that George is bringing up.
Let's see. So George's question. Or a couple. I would welcome Delia addressing his own question, gender fugitive life. I think there's a relationship, George says, between the channeling of experience and trauma into social relation, into survival as a political struggle. This is like political sublimation rather than poverty producing atomization or mobilizing to fascism. Might that make the gender less typically masculine, heroic, and more an ethos of care? That's an interesting thought. I would leave George to extrapolate on that further. I did want to actually speak to one question I saw come up here. Kwame asked a very general question on the new Shaka King film on Hampton. I'll just say, I actually thought it was outstanding. I think the history is so well done. Actually, I'm confused a bit at the fact that on some social media, I've heard it criticized as not historical or something. That's not my understanding. I'd be interested to hear from other Panther scholars. Yes, so even where they're not directly representing a historical event, they bring in histories from other chapters, from other dynamics to fill in the content. So when Fred Hampton is in prison and he's talking about the condition of the men in the prison, that's George Jackson's theorizations directly. There's so much about it. People also have criticized, I've seen the fact that it centers the informant, the man who worked for William O'Neill, the man who worked for the FBI. Honestly, I think that makes the film more effective. it's hard to relate to someone like Fred Hampton, this idealized revolutionary. And it's easier to relate to the person who feels conflicted, is willing to go against their convictions to pursue material interests. Yeah, I thought it honestly, yeah, outstanding as a film. There's a lot of questions here.
Do you want to take Michael's question about the Young Lords and some of the other national liberation movements?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know as much about the Lords. I can say bits about them. Johanna Fernandez has an outstanding book that came out, I think, last year, that some people are reading, that needs to be read. She relied on so much newly available archival material. Young Lords, a lot better on gender questions than the Panthers were from their beginning. Definitely modeled themselves, their 10-point program, their programs off of the Black Panther Party. I don't know. You know what? Yeah, this is not intercommunalism per se, but on the East Coast, where members of the Black Liberation Army, which were composed, including of Puerto Rican nationalists, former members of the Young Lords Party, in the late 70s, as some of them sought to reconnect after being underground, reconnect with the larger community. Some of them established health clinics, most famously, like Mutulu Shakur is involved in the establishment of the use of acupuncture for dealing with drug addiction and also trauma generally. That speaks to that some, but really there are other folks that can talk about that better than I can.
But maybe, do the other national liberation movements feature? Do they come across Newton's radar, like in the Panther thinking, like the La Raza Unida or the Young Lords or anybody AIM? In the documents that you've seen, do they come across the Panthers' radar, and what did they say?
The Panthers were actively inspired by the revolutions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese struggle against the US war, the Algerian Revolution, struggles in Mozambique, the invasion of the Dominican Republic. They were so aware of international dynamics. Within the US, they allied themselves explicitly with, yes, absolutely. I mean, a lot of these organizations modeled themselves after the Panthers. American Indian Movement, the Young Patriots organization composed of poor white Appalachians in Chicago, a couple of Asian American organizations that were explicitly anti-capitalist, sought to emphasize survival and saw an armed struggle as necessary for political, economic transformation. Someone here says there was a Black Panther Party office at Boston and Tremont. Being a veteran member of the Black Panther Party, I think you need to do a bit more research on the party. We had a wonderful relationship with the I'm sure YP, Young Patriots. Is that to be maybe Young Lords? Check Lincoln Hospital records. Oh yeah, the Young Lords like took over. I mean, for folks from the Bronx, Lincoln Hospital. I was born there. Young Lords took over Lincoln Hospital for a couple of days, negotiated over control of it because the conditions were so poor, people were not being well treated. Yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful if actual Black Panther Party members could actually step up, take over the microphone and speak instead, rather than myself as a young person reading books and speaking to some, I've done interviews and all this. But one thing that's been, amazing with over the last really 5-10 years is more former Panthers writing accounts, memoirs of their lives, getting to a lot of the nitty-gritty details about what things really felt like on the ground, especially gender dynamics. And really, actually, in the last few years, folks doing like video interviews, former members of the Black Liberation Army. There's from the time when I started this research until now, there's so much more data just online that like people have just uploaded themselves. It's really, really incredible.
Actually, Delio, this might be a nice time for us to segue to some contemporary questions. Maybe George's question, there's a question about BLM up here. What do you think? I mean, on everybody's mind is the contemporary relevance of some of these lessons.
Yeah, well, I think the Panthers analysis, I mean, people, like, what are the terms of today's struggle? Black Lives Matter, the mere fact of living as the thing being struggled over, right? I think the Panthers were quite prescient in that regard. It's a big question. Maybe we can kind of sharpen the question a little bit. Let's see. Gabrielle Narcisse seemed to speak about it. Okay. Is the lack of clear civil rights activist leaders and Black intellectuals of the current day Black liberation movement an advantage or disadvantage? You take issue with the inconsistency of the international momentum of the Black Lives Matter after this summer. What do you think? Why do you think the movement has lost momentum compared to the longevity of the civil rights movement of the 60s? Yeah, well, okay, yeah, thank you for those questions. Obviously, riots are not a thing that you can actually sustain, long term. The closest you can get to is the occupation of public spaces. This tactic that we've seen, in Egypt and Eastern Europe, in the U.S., etc. The matter of activist leaders and Black intellectuals, I think the movement is stronger now because it is more diffuse. It is not leaderless, but leaderful, right? As basically the prominence of male theorists as those folks have receded, more women, femme, and queer folks have been able to take up more representative space within the movement. As for loss of momentum, I'm not so sure about that. I think that movements have continued to organize and build capacity in different ways, but they don't necessarily represent themselves openly. There's also the matter, I think we're so profoundly isolated by our algorithms and social media, and then there's the matter of the criminalization of being together in spaces with people. That is its own matter that, whatever, for what it's worth, I haven't read substantial thoughts on how to navigate. It seems to me that, struggle over the resources to ensure our health when we're in collective spaces is a necessary part of any, future effort for organizing.
Well, maybe, Delia, a way to keep on sharpening the question is you talked about the Oakland electoral foray. You alluded to it very quickly, and a lot of BLM activists today are working on developing a relationship to electeds, and trying to figure out what that should be. What do you think are some of the, people interpret the Oakland run for mayor of Bobby Seale differently. What is your take on it, and what are some of the takeaways from it generously that are applicable for today's moment?
Again, I'm very hesitant to make such prescriptions, really, as an academic from my armchair. But yeah, so most famously, Corporation Jackson down south has attempted some combination of this kind of multi-pronged effort of using electoral dynamics to funnel resources or legitimacy into land-based projects. I think maybe Puerto Rico is a place that where land-based projects are really proliferating as the state has, either, depending on how you want to put it, abandoned people or replaced social services, the few that there were, with militarized repression. There's quite a few questions here I'd like to try to speak to. The former Panther here, Atno Smith, says, your question about gender and color can be addressed by researching the Constitutional Convention. There was a change to the Articles of the U.S. Constitution We addressed the Equal Rights Amendment in its early stages. Huey P. addressed the gay rights issues the very next day of Stonewall Rebellion. Absolutely. Yeah. The explicit effort on Newton's part to emphasize collaboration, coalition with the gay liberation movement, women's movement, and they had at that point already allied with a variety of the white left. They, before that, created the National Committee to Combat Fascism, which is basically the Panthers' like sub-white organization under the Panther umbrella. Let's see. Millery asked a question about Akinele Umoja's work. It may be your mention may be on his work in Mississippi, but I was curious about the relationship between the Black Panther Party, urban space, and fugitivity. Is fugitivity particularly urban? What can we say about the Black Panther Party, politics, and life in the U.S. world space in Mississippi outside of Jackson and other country realms? Yeah, there's some work, a lot less work, but definitely, as I understand it, some Panthers went down into the South during these like moments of intense repression. Really, I kind of have to speak about it, to do training, connectivity, and then some of the folks, the Angola 3, famously, who ended up in prison down there. Yeah, the question of whether the urban space as opposed to the rural space is appropriate according to third world notions of guerrilla warfare is a question that different aspects of the movement grappled with differently. It's hard to speak generally, really, because it's so disparate. And let me say this: so little research has been done on the rest of the party outside of Oakland. Judson Jeffries really has done so much on this front. Yahoo Williams on local chapter dynamics in places that a lot of people didn't realize had Panther chapters. And really, so much of that work remains to be done. Maybe this talk today can encourage more people to dive into that work. Let's see, other questions here. Paolo Chakravarti asks, could you say more about the argument about the violence of hunger that the Panthers were making, since this is a familiar argument from third world peasant movements around the same time, and is, did I lose it? Oh, was it recategorized? And is pressing concern to movements around the world today around debt, food security, and hunger. What lessons can be learned from this lesson on dimensions of Panthers organizing and focus? I'm not sure what else to add to that, honestly. I'll say, sometimes I'm not very good at the question and answer part. So just to say that.
No, you're doing great. We're wanting you to be prescriptive. That's why. You're hesitating.
Well, yes.
How about this Nkrumah question that Duncan is asking?
Where's that? Thank you. I don't mean to be avoidant. Paula,
no. I know we're
that question
from
further later. I know. I'm interested more in some of these people's thoughts behind the questions rather than my limited answers. In terms of other liberation movements in Africa, Duncan asks, I know there was a lot of interaction with Nkrumah in Ghana, especially his Little Black Book, or the Axioms of Kwame Nkrumah. There's reported to circulate widely in the Black Panther Party in the US. Yeah, definitely. I can say not as much about that. Newton was definitely thinking about Nkrumah's account of neocolonialism. And for what it's worth, the theory of intercommunalism is intended to also be a critique or building upon or an adjustment or a revision, if you will, of Nkrumah's account of neocolonialism. Let's say on the Pan-African question, let's say more generally, the thought was that by struggling, I mean, this is a point the Panthers made early on, though, by struggling locally against the US state and capital, against white supremacy there, they were essentially making the struggle easier for their, if you would, comrades in struggle elsewhere. He has a short passage talking about movements in Mozambique, and he says, we don't have resources to lend to our brothers in, say, the gendered aspect, brothers in Mozambique. What can we do to help them? Well, we can engage in an extended struggle against their oppressors, US imperialists here, thereby making things easier for them there. Now, I will add one further point. Noon has definitely been critiqued, and increasingly, I think rightly, for a deferral of the question of culture, African culture, and revolutionary culture. He leans very much towards Fanon, I think, or past Fanon, in emphasizing that whatever culture is produced by the people during struggle is the valuable one, that there's almost no need for the cultural nationalist imagery, representation, practices, etc. He's criticized for this by East Coast Panthers quite a lot, Black Liberation Army quite a lot. And I actually think that his position kind of ignores the fact that cultural nationalism as it developed in the US in the 60s and 70s, as well as prior iterations earlier in the century, should be understood as part of the revolutionary culture that colonized Black people in the US were producing for themselves, rather than this kind of, I think, harsher dismissal as kind of with Fanon, dismissal of like the negritude movement, and as if it was produced only by intellectuals. And it's not the case that cultural nationalism in the US was only popular among intellectuals. That's my understanding historically. The questions. Yeah, I wish Mr. Anno Smith could speak for us here instead of myself. He says the 10-point program addresses these issues of hunger, especially in number 10, right? And then later, in 1972, as the Panthers incorporate the demand for also control of technology, that would figure into the question of, I guess, the mass production of foodstuffs for addressing the hunger question. Let's see. Vasuki has a question. Just a quick question following on your really helpful comments about the gender politics of insurgent organizations. This came up in our Young Lords discussion earlier today. On the one hand, Vasuki tells us the formal or most visible leadership seems male, the stereotypical Che Guevara model. But on the other hand, the most radical strategies were not necessarily men with guns, but in the register of care. For instance, today we were talking about Young Lords sweeping the city streets as part of the garbage strike. Can you share your reflections on how these lines of influence worked within the dynamics of Panther organizing? Yeah, so as best as I've been able to trace, I've been interested in Atno Smith's thought on this also. At the very start, gender dynamics, like say within the first year or so, in terms of the labor of care, was enforced in a patriarchal manner. The Panthers engaged in what you might call an explicitly feminist turn, maybe like a year and a half in, by at least definitely by 69, late 68, I think. And then whenever they would encounter local chapters that had this prior patriarchal model of expecting women to do the cooking or something, they would discipline those local chapters and insist on a more equitable distribution of all kinds of labor. This definitely improved over time within the Panthers. And as we know, by the mid-70s, more women were in positions of formal leadership. Lane Brown, Kathleen Cleaver, most famously, Erica Huggins as the head of the Liberation School in Oakland. And this is to also say nothing of the, for different reasons, prominent position of women in some of the East Coast and other iterations of the Panthers. People like Sophia Bukhari, who's I would, Sophia Bukhari's work, I'd strongly recommend her writing. She passed away some years ago, but her takes on the Panthers, everything from gender dynamics to underground militancy to police repression, are really brilliant, frankly. And of course, Assata Shakur's presence on the East Coast is well known as part of those underground struggles.
Yeah. So Delia, I think these are good, and I think we're coming on time pretty soon. I want to make sure you tell us if this is a work in progress as your last remark. But as we're coming on time, you know, we always happens when you give a great talk, you get too many questions. So congratulations on that. So is there any final thoughts or comments? And is this coming out as how does this fit in your work?
Sure. This is a talk. Well, I've given versions of this talk over time, and I've adjusted it as my thinking on these questions has sharpened or been better informed by historical materials. I don't have contemporary plans to write it, but maybe I should. But that's what I have. Just looking at these last questions here, asking about anarchist politics of militants like Balagoon, Irving, and also question of violence of hunger versus violence of work. Yeah, it's worth noting that, yeah, again, on the East Coast, the rejection of the authoritarianism of the West Coast was really strong, so much more decentralized, so much more strongly feminist and anti-sexist. Kwesi Balagoon identified as gay and had a partner that was trans. And again, these histories have really barely been engaged with by scholars. Not that scholars need to be the only people doing that work. It's quite clear that other people at this point, young folks especially, have been examining these histories and reading about them. Great. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Delia, and finally, people are telling us that they want to read this essay that comes from this talk the minute you write it. A lot of people are saying that. Please write it.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. And let's end with Atno Smith's line, and then we'll be done. He says, the Oakland chapter was very instrumental in supporting the farm workers during the grape and lettuce boycott, and we had no choice in giving leadership to women. Most men were jailed out of the US and murdered. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gianpaolo. Thank you, Mehmet. Thank you, Urban Democracy Lab. Good night.
What a pleasure, Delio. Thank you so much.